Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Saw the slide that just went up. That's for the Mentor site and the Mentor Alias, which is a program at Microsoft Human Resources. The last time I looked at their site, the rules seem to be if you've been at Microsoft for 1 year, you can sign up on the site to get a mentor. And then after you've been at Microsoft for 2 years, you can sign up on the site to be a mentor. So it's like it's the circle of life at Microsoft. It's beautiful. And I've heard just incredibly wonderful things about people using this resource, and I'm very excited about it. Our guest today is Eric Liu, who's currently a professor at the University of Washington. He's also a fellow at the New America Foundation and has had just an incredible experience. I think he's just worked in some really fascinating areas. Of course, my favorite job that he's had is the Clinton speechwriter job, which I hope we all ask lots of questions about, because that's just fascinating. But of course, today he's here to talk about mentoring and how we get to be mentors and how we get to learn from the mentors in our life. Please help me welcome Eric Liu.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you. I'm actually going to climb out from behind the podium here. First of all, let me just thank you, Tamara, and thank Microsoft for hosting this event. Kim Ricketts and Kate Lilly from Kim Ricketts Books have also been incredible friends and partners, not only in this event, but a whole series that we've been doing around the area all year so far. It's just really delightful to be here with you, and really let me encourage those of you who have sat on the wings to come into the center here. What I thought I'd do is speak for about 15, 20 minutes or so about the book and about the journey that undergirds the book, and then really open it up to conversation with all of you about mentoring and about the different themes of this journey. The book that I'm describing is this one right here, Guiding Lights, and it's about life-changing mentors and teachers from all different walks. Everything from a Marine Corps drill instructor to a master clown to the Seattle Mariners pitching coach to a Hollywood acting coach, an inner-city entrepreneur, high school speech and debate coach, all different kinds of folks from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, and the relationships that they form with their apprentices of one kind or another. And what I've tried to capture in these stories are moments and phases and relationships of transformation. Now, the book itself is the product of about almost 2.25 years research and travel and journey on my part. And I spent time just literally going all over the country looking for these folks. And I probably spent significant time with about 300 different mentors and teachers of different kinds and different walks. And my fundamental premise going into the book and into all this research was that every one of us, in every social role we play, is a teacher. But the thing is, we are mindful of that role and responsibility only a fraction of the time. And so it doesn't matter whether you're thinking of yourself in your role as an employee or a manager here at Microsoft, or as a parent, or as a neighbor, or as a citizen or civic activist, or a member of a faith group, whatever it may be. In every one of these different roles that you play in life, you are teaching and influencing people around you. And with that premise and the sense that what was missing for so many of us in so many of our lives is mindfulness, awareness of that web of relationship and obligation that we're all woven into, it was with that sense that what I wanted to do was to heighten that mindfulness that I went out on these travels. And so as I spent time with all these, as I said, 300 different folks from different backgrounds, as diverse in profession and ethnicity and culture and corners of the country as you can imagine, no matter who I was talking to and what their deal was or what their literally or figuratively their language was, I would ask them the same 2 questions over and over. I would ask them, who influenced you? And then I would ask them, how are you passing that on? And in a sense, it doesn't have to get a whole lot more complicated than those two questions. I think that if you put those two questions, who influenced you and how do you pass it on, in front of anybody, it doesn't matter if you've known them for 30 seconds or for 30 years, you get very quickly to the heart of who that other human being is. Because when you put those two questions before them, what you're doing is extending an invitation to them to stop and pause and take inventory of all the people and all the experiences, both for good and for ill, that have shaped them in different ways. And then all the ways, again, in every social role that they play in life and in society, that they are passing it on or failing to. And so I put those two questions before these folks, and the stories that emerged. Whenever you extend an invitation like that, what is wonderfully empowering as the story finder is how much people are moved immediately to begin reflecting and then sharing stories from their own lives. And the stories that began to flow in were just incredible. And pretty soon the challenge for me wasn't finding enough good stories and enough interesting people, but really trying to figure out how to narrow it down and how to go deeper in some of these stories. So ultimately that 300 that I started with did work its way down to about the 15 or 16 or so whose stories I tell in greater depth and with greater meaning between the covers of this book. Throughout these stories, there are a few themes that I think are woven that I'd like to just speak to today, that I think really capture the essence of any kind of mentoring relationship, but speak as well to the particular challenges and opportunities that you have when you think about mentoring and being mentored in an environment like Microsoft. And I'll preface this by saying that, among the life experiences that I've had before embarking on this book, I did work in politics and worked in the White House, but I also spent some time at a company that some of you might have heard of, Real Networks, over across the lake. And so I have, through that and through other experience as a contributor to Slate and to MSNBC, more than passing familiarity with the kind of world and culture here of Microsoft. And when we get into the conversation part of this, we'd be really happy to talk about how some of these stories and ideas apply specifically to the lives you live here. There are a few themes that I wanted to talk about that flow through the book. And the first one of these themes is purpose. If you've seen the book, you'll notice that the subtitle of Guiding Lights is The People Who Lead Us Toward Our Purpose in Life. It's not the people who give us specific information in life, or the people who teach us concrete knowledge, or the people who impart particular skills. It's the people who lead us toward our purpose in life. And to me, that's a very deliberate choice there. Because what matters when you look at any kind of mentoring relationship, and it doesn't matter whether it's happening at work, at home, at play, at church, whatever, ultimately, what makes the truly meaningful relationships meaningful is that they aren't really about what they seem to be about. And so let me tell you one story that illustrates this. It's the story of a guy named Tom Brown, who is an inner-city entrepreneur in Washington, D.C. Excuse me, I'm fighting off allergies this week. Tom Brown is, as I say, an inner-city entrepreneur, and in a sense what he really is a serially failed entrepreneur. He's had one scheme and business idea after another just crash and burn and crater. And he's always coming up with other goofy ideas and bringing them up with equal passion and commitment. But after the 6th or 7th of these actually fails, Tom Brown finds himself one day standing on the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C., ready to jump, ready to end it all, because he's just reached the end of his line. And that day, Tom actually gets pulled off the bridge. The cops show up, and actually the TV cameras come, and it becomes this big to-do. And Tom Brown gets this, in a sense, unwanted, uninvited second act to his life. The thing that he, amidst all the chaos of the cops coming and the noise and the cameras and the helicopters, the one thing he remembers about getting pulled off the bridge is what the cop said to him as he reached out and grabbed his hand, and he said, "The Lord isn't done with you yet." And Tom didn't really know what that meant, and in the aftermath of getting pulled off that bridge, tried to puzzle through what it meant and what it meant to have this second act to his life. And he was trying to figure out some sense of purpose for his being, when somebody suggested to him, somebody who he knew in the neighborhood, that, the local high school, Tom, Anacostia High School is actually looking for a teacher to teach this brand new course on entrepreneurship, on how to start and run a small business. And Tom thinks to himself, well, I know the part about starting a business. I'm not so good at running them, but what the heck, I'll try this. And Tom decides to go and teach this entrepreneurship class at Anacostia High School. And in doing this, he meets this child in the class, a 15-year-old boy named Quincy Pratt. And he's a child. But at the same time, Quincy has, in his 15 years, suffered more pain and trauma than most of us would want to experience in a lifetime. His own family's been completely broken apart by drugs and by violence. He's bounced from foster home to foster home to foster home, and at the time Tom Brown encounters Quincy Pratt, Quincy's been living already for some time in court-approved independent living. And so the good news about this kid, Quincy, is that he's a survivor. He's made it this far in ways that people all around him have not been able to. But the bad news from Tom Brown's perspective, from his teacher's perspective, is that this child, Quincy, is almost pathologically self-reliant. He doesn't trust anybody, doesn't count on anybody, he doesn't ask anybody for help, he doesn't believe in anybody. And so the challenge for Tom Brown in teaching this child is, on one level, about the nuts and bolts of teaching him about entrepreneurship. And what Quincy's interested in is starting a laundromat in Southeast. So on one level, what Tom has to teach him is the nuts and bolts of starting a laundromat. Okay, you want to start a laundromat? Who are you going to talk to about real estate? Who are you going to ask for advice about the right kind of equipment to lease? Who do you know who has some knowledge about the right sorts of price points you want to set for the services you want to offer? And who are you going to enroll and enlist in the project of spreading the word about your new venture, marketing this thing? And as I say, on the surface, this is a curriculum about the nuts and bolts of starting a small business. But of course, right beneath that surface, what Tom Brown is really teaching Quincy Pratt is, how are you going to learn to ask for help? How are you going to learn to put yourself in situations where you have to rely on somebody else? And when they fail you, as they may well, how are you going to find the wherewithal, the courage, to go back to them and ask them again for help? In a sense, what Tom Brown has to teach Quincy Pratt is nothing short of how to be a human being again, how to imagine himself once again as woven into this web of relationship and obligation that is so often so invisible to all of us. And over the course of their relationship, there's a remarkable transformation that is wrought. Tom Brown does teach Quincy the nuts and bolts of business, and he also teaches him these deeper lessons as well about how to be, about how to move in the world with others and seek their help and count on them. And if the story were to end right there, to my mind, that would be transformation enough. Quincy actually not only ends up focusing on this business, but he gets his whole life kind of put together and he ends up making it to college. But in the book, I don't actually end the story there. I end the story after Quincy's already gone off to college, gone down to North Carolina to start as a freshman. And I'm back with Tom Brown by himself in Anacostia. And Tom reflects on the nature and the course of this relationship, and he realizes two things. He realizes, first of all, that he has saved this child, Quincy Pratt. But the second thing he realizes is that in saving Quincy, he saved himself. That Tom Brown led himself to a deeper, clearer sense of purpose and meaning and calling than he'd ever been able to find in any other way in his life up to that point. And so I tell that story for a couple reasons. One is to illustrate again that it's about purpose. We have no idea in 5 years' time whether Quincy Pratt's going to remember anything that he learned about wholesaling versus retailing and about this thing versus that thing in marketing. But we can be sure that Quincy will have completely absorbed those lessons about how to be and how to move in the world. But the second reason why I tell that story, apart from highlighting that theme of purpose, is that it reminds us that in any meaningful relationship of mentoring, it is not simply the apprentice who is changed. It is the master as well. It's not simply the pupil, but the teacher too. There's a second theme that arises quite often through these stories that I think is Well, in many ways pertinent to the work that you do here, and yet something that maybe it's not always safe or easy to talk about, and that is the theme of failure. Failure. And I have two different stories to kind of bring up in the context of failure that I think are relevant. To me, what was interesting about all the people who I wrote about in Guiding Lights wasn't simply the fact that they were all excellent teachers or mentors or managers or leaders, but that all of them in one form or another had faltered and failed. And in fact, continually faltered and failed. And what was interesting to me was what they did with that. Brian Price is one of the people who I've written about in this book, and if any of you follow baseball, you know that Brian is the pitching coach for the Seattle Mariners. And he's a young guy, he's about 42, but he's already incredibly highly esteemed in his profession. He was Baseball Weekly's pitching coach of the year a couple years ago, and just a really bright guy. And Brian, the reason why I write about him and the relationships that I focus in on aren't just about the success stories and about the things that he's done to over the course of his several years now as coach to develop and cultivate good pitchers. But I actually focus in on one relationship in particular with a guy named Freddie Garcia. And again, if you know baseball, you don't have to know baseball, but if you know baseball, Freddie Garcia is a guy who was a pitcher on the Mariners, who was by far the most talented and able guy on the pitching staff. Had the best stuff, and when he was on, Freddie Garcia was practically unhittable. He was just unbeatable. But the problem with Freddie is that he was only intermittently on. You know, from start to start, from inning to inning, he would kind of go in and out of concentration and never be able to hold it together, particularly during the course of this season that I followed them, which was 2 seasons ago, 2003. And so Brian, all year long, is trying to figure out how to get into Freddie's head and how to get Freddie to a place of more consistently high performance. And so Brian's trying every which way he can in every angle of entry. He tries for a while an incredibly warm and nurturing approach. And then he tries kind of tough talk and tough love. He tries lots and lots of talk. And then he tries a silent treatment. He tries lots of kind of mechanical, physical things. And then he tries lots of kind of mental, psychological things. And nothing Brian tries works. And over the course of the season, Freddie is just that inconsistent, literally from month to month. His May is terrible, his June is fantastic, and so on and so forth through the year. And by the end of the season, I happened to be there in the locker room at Safeco Field when Brian and Freddie walk past each other. And the season's pretty much over, and Freddie's kind of had a failure of a season. And as they walked past each other, they looked at each other with these kind of wounded eyes and had nothing to say to each other except one word, which is just a hey. And just in that one little hey was this incredible admission on both parts of failure. Ways in which the coach had failed the player and the player had failed the coach. And probably not surprisingly, the next year, Freddie Garcia was traded to the White Sox. Now, when you stop and think about that, from a coaching and mentoring perspective, that is a colossal failure. That the most talented and able person on your team, you basically had to give away to another team because the coach was not able to cultivate that person's talent and to fully develop his potential. And so I tell that story partly just to show that even the really good coaches, and Brian Price is really one of the great ones, fail and falter regularly because that's baseball and that's life. But the other reason why I focus in on that relationship is because what's interesting to me is what Brian Price does afterwards. And so after that season, that terrible season, Brian spends all off season and much of the next season unpacking that relationship with Freddie and trying to think about what he could have done differently. And he's reliving it, and it's prompting him to re-examine other coaching and mentoring relationships earlier in his career. And he's thinking about, if I'd just done this or just done that, or maybe I could have done this. And at one point, Brian just realizes something very simple, which is that if somewhere along the way he had only said to Freddie Garcia something like, Freddie, please help me. Please help me help you. That something that simple might have unlocked Freddie. We don't know if it would have, but it might have. And Brian realizes in looking back that the reason why he never went there was that as a man, as an athlete, and I think most importantly, as a coach, as the one nominally in charge and in authority, he could not bring himself to ask for that kind of help from his erstwhile pupil. And when Brian realizes that about himself, he resolves at that moment that for the next crop of pitchers who he's going to have to cultivate, the next year and the year after that, he's not going to let that kind of pride and that kind of fear stand in the way. Now, does that mean overnight transformation and wonderful results? No. I mean, 2004 was not a good year for the Mariners, and who knows what this season's going to bring. But there's a saying that Brian tries to impart on all his pitchers, which is that it's possible to pitch winning baseball even when you don't win the games. And when he says that to his pitchers, what he's telling his pitchers about is preparation, discipline, self-awareness, self-coaching, mound presence, bearing. That if you bring all these things to the way you play the game, then a lot of things that go on behind you once the ball's put into play are out of your control. You may still lose the game. But if you know you came in as a pitcher with that dedication and preparation, then you've pitched winning baseball. And Brian's message is just as applicable to his own work. That it's possible as a coach to be a winning coach, even if the results that you yield are not by a win-loss record in the black. Failure on the other side, not just the coach's failure, but the mentee's failure, or the pupil's failure, is something else that comes up a lot in the course of the stories of this book. And I just want to kind of tell a quick story about this. There's a guy who I write about in the book named Bob Abramson, who is a teacher at Juilliard. And what Bob teaches at Juilliard is a thing called the Dalcroze method, which is the sort of 19th century method of eurythmics, kind of body motion and rhythm and music, that when you boil it down in layman's terms, what his job is, Bob's job at Juilliard, is to take these incredibly virtuosic, highly trained, almost robotic musicians who are at Juilliard, whose standard is perfection or near perfection, and to try to restore to them some sense of feel and soul to the way that they play music. That's his job. He's the field teacher. And the way that Bob Abramson does this, he's got a very wide repertoire. Some of it is about the kind of physical gestures and motions of eurythmics. But a lot of it, and a lot more of it, is just about how he and his pupils confront mistakes and failure. When you're in an environment like Juilliard, which I think is not unlike an environment like Microsoft, a world-class environment where you have people who are at the top of the top of the top of the pyramid, and where the standards for excellence are so high as to sometimes be oppressive, well, every little error, every little slip, and every little mistake can feel, to people at Juilliard at least, like the difference between a great career and a failed career. The stakes are so high, and the baggage that they carry is so weighty. And so one of the things that Bob does, if he's working with one of his students playing piano, you know, the student will be sitting there playing piano for Bob, and the student will make a mistake. All right, he might play an F sharp instead of an F natural. And just out of reflex, what that student will say as he's playing is, "Oh, sorry." And Bob, when that kid says sorry, does a very interesting thing. Bob has this voice that, because of throat cancers and throat surgeries, he's got only one vocal cord left. And so he talks like this. And so when the kid is playing along and he makes that little mistake and he says sorry, Bob just leans right over him and he says, "Who are you talking to?" And the kid kind of chuckles and thinks, "Ah, that's kind of funny," and he keeps playing. And Bob persists and he says, "No, really, who are you talking to?" And he makes the kid stop for a minute and think, who am I talking to? Who am I just reflexively apologizing to when I make a mistake? To myself? Is it to you, Bob, because you haven't slapped my wrist or anything? Is it to Juilliard for letting in such a slacker? Is it to my parents for all that they did for investing in me, and still I make a mistake like playing F sharp? Like, who am I apologizing to? Who is judging me? Who do I think is judging me? And so then the second thing Bob does after the kid makes this mistake and reflects on who he's talking to is he asks the kid, "Did you make a mistake?" Which is to say, Bob plays dumb a little bit. Of course he heard the F sharp instead of the F natural. But what he does is he asks that kid there to own it and to say it. And so the kid will say, "Well, yeah, I played an F sharp instead of an F natural." And then what Bob does is the least expected thing for these Juilliard students, because at that point, these students are well trained over a lifetime of high stakes teaching and testing to get their wrists slapped. And what Bob then says to that kid after the kid admits the mistake and owns it is, he says, "Why do you think you made that mistake?" Which is an incredibly powerful question. Instead of turning that little error into this mark and moment of stigma and judgment and failure and all the pressures that come to bear on a Juilliard kid, he turned that mistake into the subject of an inquiry. Why do you think you made that mistake? What could you discover about why you made that mistake? Was it because you were tired? Was it because your mind was 3 pages ahead? Was it because you hadn't practiced? Was it because something else? Was it because you were thinking of a different piece? Why? And then finally, what Bob does, which I think is the most important thing in how he deals with these errors and mistakes and failures of his students, is he tells the kid that next time he plays, say, F sharp instead of F natural in that passage, not to stop, not to say sorry, but to take that F sharp and make something out of it. To improvise for a measure, 5 measures if you want, 5 minutes if you want. Start improvising around that error and create something out of it. Because there's no audience here. There's nobody judging. It's just Bob and the kid. And all Bob wants is that kid to be able to take that mistake and turn it into the material for discovery and creation. That, to me, is the essence of what this kind of powerful teaching and mentoring is about taking the stuff and the material of failure and converting it into possibility. I do have another story to tell, but I also know that time is short. We've got a lot of folks here, and it might be fun to leave some time for deeper conversation. So let me just close on this other note here. When you talk about purpose and leading others to purpose in the way that you mentor them, or if you're the one who's being mentored, trying to search out beneath that level of what the surface curriculum is to what your own sense of purpose and yearning and calling are in the work that you're doing or the life that you're living. And then you couple that with not only an acknowledgement of failure and faltering and shortcoming, but a celebration of it. A real mindset that says every mentoring relationship, every human relationship is shot through with failure. Failure to connect, failure to imagine, failure to deliver, failure to conceptualize. The question isn't how do we banish failure. The question is simply how do we fail well? What do we make of that failure? And from the perspective of both the apprentice and the master, if you couple those two questions of purpose and the purpose of failure, then I think, especially in a realm like this, where your job, in a sense, is to unleash imagination, and your job is to spark others to greater sense of their own possibility, intellectual, personal, and otherwise, that you're going to be well on the way to guiding them to be the best people they can be. I just want to close by saying a word about where the title Guiding Lights even came from, because it speaks, I think, to one other facet of all of these relationships in mentoring, which is the limitations of mentoring. Guiding Lights comes from a story in the book about a guy named Father Greg Boyle, who is an inner city priest in East Los Angeles. And Father Greg's kind of developed the moniker of the homeboy priest, because over the years he has started and run a jobs program for gangsters and ex-gangsters, mainly Latino youth there in East LA. And he's taken them off the streets and into a silk screening business or a bakery or a landscape business, what have you. And over these years, Father Greg has just touched and saved and steered countless numbers of these boys. But for Father Greg, what he is conscious of is not all those that he has saved. The tally that he keeps is something very different. In fact, the very day that I met Father Greg, he was late for his appointment because he had just been burying his 114th child. That's the tally that Father Greg keeps, and what he's conscious of and, in a sense, haunted by. And even for somebody like him, who's in the business of grace, it's very hard to sustain that measure of grace and purpose without experiencing the very human feeling of burnout. And what ultimately pulled Father Greg back from the brink of just being completely burned out and dried out by the experience of working with these hard cases was a dream that one of these kids, these ex-gangsters, told Father Greg. And in the dream, this kid is in a pitch dark room, just completely blind, stumbling around in the dark. And he's trying to find his bearings, and he's trying to grope his way to the wall to find a light switch. The kid in the dream has this sense that Father Greg is in the room, but Father Greg's not saying anything or doing anything or moving. And so the kid just increasingly gets more frustrated as he continues to stumble around in the dark. And he asks himself, why isn't Father Greg doing something to help me? Until finally, after a while, Father Greg, who in this dream is in the room, decides to act. And what he does is he takes a flashlight that's in his hand, and he turns on that flashlight. And he aims the beam of that flashlight through the darkness of the room and shines it on the point on the wall where the light switch is. And when the kid sees that light, that beam of light, he thinks to himself, oh, I get it. It's on me. It's on me to get up and stand up and walk across the room and turn on that light switch. And when that kid told Father Greg that dream, it had the effect of releasing Father Greg. Releasing Father Greg from this sense that his job was to turn on the light switch for everybody he encountered. That his job was to save everybody he encountered. Because the reality is, even for somebody who is blessed in many ways with those gifts, there's a limit to what you as a single human being can do. And what Father Greg came to realize is that sometimes the only thing you can do, but indeed sometimes the very best thing you can do, is simply to wield that flashlight and aim that beam. That's where the title of this book comes from. And it's what I wanted to close on, because when we think about mentoring and we think about the ways in which, again, in every dimension of our lives, here at work, at home, at play, in other settings, the ways in which we teach and shape and influence one another, you know, we have to stop and reflect and realize we've all been there on both sides of that dream. We've all been that person. We may well be today that person who's stumbling around blindly in the dark trying to figure out where the light switch is. But whether or not that is you today, I guarantee you that today, every one of us in this room is that person holding the flashlight. Every one of us is that person who retains this power, this capacity to awaken other people to a fuller sense of their own potential, to a deeper sense of their own possibility. And where it begins first is with our own mindfulness of that power, and then with that power to bring others to mindfulness. In a sense, it goes back to those same two questions. Who influenced you, and how do you pass it on? And if we do nothing with those two questions but pass them on, then I think we'll be able, here in this campus and in our community, to make a lot of change. Thank you very much. Happy to entertain any questions about the book or otherwise, or really hear any stories that any of you may have. Yes, sir?
The way you speak about purpose suggests to me that you feel that there is some sort of preordained purpose that each individual has. Is that the case? And if so, what basis do you have for it?
That's a very interesting question. Because it brings us, for one reason, it brings us pretty close to the language, the metaphors of religion. I myself believe that every one of us has potential that goes deeply untapped. I believe that every one of us, in searching out, defining, honing that potential, has at least the possibility of defining a purpose. The word you use of preordained gets us into a more ecclesiastical debate, which isn't really my debate. You know, I think that whether your view is that the preordination comes from a divine power or comes simply from the stuff and material of our DNA, the reality is that every human being, whatever your skill set, whatever your experience base, whatever your culture, whatever your shortcomings and limitations, has some set of capacities that make you uniquely able to make some kind of contribution to some circle. Now, that circle may not be, for everybody in this room, the world. Not everybody in this room is going to change the world, period, directly. But that circle may simply be your family. And by changing your family, you may well change the world. And that sense of purpose, to me, that flows from an awareness that we are here not just to mark time, and we are here not just as a sack of skills, deficits, and predispositions, but that each person's unique alignment of potential and ability calls you, in a sense, and again, I don't mean that necessarily in a religious way, in a church-oriented way, but calls you to ask yourself those two questions. Who influenced you and how do you pass it on? Calls you to take a clearer, more conscious inventory of what you can be doing in the world. Many of you are probably familiar with Good to Great, the Jim Collins book, and that little Venn diagram that he has in there. And I forget the exact 3 circles, but what can you be the best in the world at? What drives your economic engine? And what's the third one? And another one. But this kind of overlap of in a sense, businesses, lines of businesses that companies are in. And if you take that same set of Venn diagrams to your own personal life and think about, what am I uniquely capable of? How am I engaged in the world right now? And is that form of engagement actually tapping my unique skills and potential? And if not, is there somebody out there, a mentor, a boss, a friend, a coach, a parent, a neighbor, a pastor, a counselor? Is there somebody out there who can help draw something more out of me? Is there somebody out there who, maybe not necessarily in a happy, warm way, but in a whip-cracking way? I write a lot about mentors here. I don't write so much about what a colleague of mine calls tormentors. The negative influences who shape us as well. But regardless of whether you're talking about mentors or tormentors, thinking about how do I then search them out? Because I think that when you take that kind of concrete inventory of what you've got, what you bring to the table, and try to align that to what you're doing in the world, you come pretty close to a clearer sense of purpose, of why you should be working 18 hours at Microsoft a day, why you should be doing the things that you do outside of work, what's going to last from the time that you have on this earth that's going to outlive you. Yes, sir.
I have to ask the same question that you asked in the beginning of this talk. Who influenced you as an author, successful author, first, Clinton or somebody else, and how did you pass that on?
One of the things that on the influences question, I think I had this naive notion when I set out on this book, on the journey, that somewhere along the way in all these travels and encountering all these hundreds of people, I was going to find this one great life-saving mentor for me. Because part of what prompted the whole journey, to be quite honest, was I'd reached a point in my own life where I was just thinking on a very basic level, it sure would be nice to have a mentor right now. It sure would be nice. I just reached a point in life where I'd become a father recently, I'd had a lot of life and career changes, and I was just thinking, I really wish I had somebody to guide me through some of this. And I think I had this idea as I went on the travels for the book that I was going to find this one great figure, and I didn't. Instead, what I found and realized is that what I had to do was what I think almost all of us have to do most of the time, and that is cobble together a composite mentor. That's a little bit of this person, a little bit of that one, a little bit of this boss and that manager, a little bit of this experience or that one, and form that composite and hold it in our head and in our heart, let it grow and change and adapt. So my answer to your first question is that there's, in almost every dimension of my life as a writer, my life in politics, there's a different set of people who add to that composite. I would still say kind of centrally, foremost among all of them, it isn't Clinton, actually, it's my mother. It's my mother most powerfully, and in very different ways at different stages of our lives and our relationship. it's one thing when I was 0 to my early 20s. And then in the last 14 years or so, partly because I've entered into full-on manhood, fatherhood, partly because it was at that break point that my own father passed away. The nature of the ways in which my mother has taught me and let me teach her, and therefore teach me even more, has really changed and deepened and gotten more richly textured. In terms of how I pass things on, I think it begins for me most centrally at home also. I have a daughter who's 5 now. And the entire endeavor of doing this book and over these last couple of months, traveling around the country and spending time in conversation with people about the book has taught me so much about how to be, and how to carry myself, and how to ask questions, and how to deal with failure, and how to do all these things that I'm trying in every little way I can to impart to Olivia, to my daughter. But I hope that the writing of the book itself is a measure or a way for me to pass things on as well. I myself came to a clearer sense of purpose in the course of doing this book. I wouldn't say that that has given me a short one-word answer to the question, what am I going to do when I grow up? But it has given me this clearer sense that one thing that I'm good at, one thing that I like to do, is to be both a story finder and a storyteller. Kind of harvest story from people and then pull it together in a way that reflects back to them in meaningful ways so that they can reflect on changes and forces within their own lives. And I'm not sure I would have been able to articulate that 2-3 years ago. But the journey of encountering these folks, digesting what they did, learning from them, writing about them, speaking about them, has changed me that way. And so I try in every setting I'm in now, whether it's something formal like this or just dinner with friends, to be conscious of trying to pass something on. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is a pretty specific question. So assume there's someone has great talent, but maybe he or she just not confident in herself, or always thinking she cannot finish the task or do something else.
Yeah.
How do you influence her or him to realize, he has the potential to do things he wanted to do and really accomplish something?
That is a fantastic and fundamental question, especially at a place like this. I'm going to tell you about a positive mentoring story, and then I'm going to tell you about my own tour mentor experience. The positive mentoring story actually comes from the book as well, and it's actually a pretty analogous business story. It's at Procter & Gamble. And it's a story about a woman named Diane Dietz, who is the general manager for oral care marketing. So she runs Crest and Scope and Glide and all these huge mega brands. And I write about the relationship between Diane and a junior newcomer to her team named Jocelyn Wong. And Diane and Jocelyn are day and night. Diane is this brash, expressive, tough-talking Chicago chick. She wears her emotions on her sleeve, and she's really out there. She shouts, laughs, cries in meetings, the whole thing. Jocelyn is timid, lacking in self-confidence, the very kind of narrowed, straightened product of a very strict and severe Confucian upbringing. Diane and Jocelyn is only at P&G. She's an engineer. She's only been an engineer. She only went to engineering school. She only went to Purdue for its engineering major because that's what her parents wanted her to do. And she was on this kind of path that was someone else's vision of her purpose. And so she's at P&G and she's an engineer, and she doesn't expect to be really happy at it, but what surprises her is that when she starts there at the company, she's terrible at it. She's really bad. She's having these accidents in the factory floor. She's just messing things up. And so she's about to quit the company, Jocelyn is, when she meets Diane Dietz at some corporate event. And Diane has this sense about people, first of all, about maybe some untapped talents that lie within people, just that she picks up in conversation. But you don't have to be even that intuitive to see when you first meet Jocelyn, as Diane did, she sensed that this was a person who, whatever her skill sets, was yearning on a fundamental level to be something other than what she was, something more than what she was. And so just on instinct, Diane said to Jocelyn, well, if you're going to quit the company anyway, why don't you come over to the marketing team for a while? I know you don't have an MBA, you don't know a thing one about marketing, but what the heck? Just join us over here. You might like it here, and you might enjoy it here, and what do you have to lose? And so Jocelyn decides she doesn't have anything to lose, and she goes over to the marketing team. And the rest of that story of that relationship is how, step by step, in carefully calculated, scaffolded ways, Diane Dietz puts Jocelyn into situations where she can not only develop a skill set in marketing, but to develop and find a voice. And what Jocelyn discovers as Diane carefully puts her into one setup situation after another is Jocelyn realizes, wow, I have this kind of creative artistic side to me. My tastes on logo design, or on what a good print advertisement looks like, or on a new brand architecture for a new line of toothpaste product. Like, people actually think these are good ideas, Nobody's laughing me out of the room, and people are responding to this. And the people at the ad agencies like talking to me about this stuff. And I'm pretty good at this. And bit by bit, Diane put Jocelyn into situations where she could find that voice and develop that sense of, again, not just confidence in her specific skill set, but a deeper sense of purpose. That she was there to be something other than somebody's wished-for engineer. Now, by the end of the story, Jocelyn is so, in a sense, opened up that she's not even sure she wants to stay at P&G anymore. She's not even sure that it can contain her newly found creative impulses. And to Diane Dietz, that's just great. Because Diane's whole philosophy as a team leader, as general manager there, is not, I've got to drive everybody on my team for the best results that they can deliver so that we as a unit can deliver the best P&L results. Her philosophy is, really, I've got to make sure that every member of my team feels like she or he is being the fullest possible self they can be. Now, for some of them, when they discover that, it's going to mean, as it did for several other members of the team, it's going to mean that they're going to go off and quit P&G and start a restaurant, or quit P&G and become a screenwriter, But for those who, in the course of discovering their fullest possible selves, also come to discover that they can express that self within the parameters of P&G, those people who stay on the team are going to make that team unstoppable. That's Diane's belief and faith, and it's borne out by her results, her business results. And so that story to me, Diane uses a metaphor of what she did with Jocelyn, which was to kind of unscrew the lid of the jar that was holding Jocelyn. And that jar was made up of other people's expectations, of Jocelyn's own limited self-concept of what she could be, of the kind of pressures and preordained paths that a corporation sets out for people and makes you think are possible. And Diane's task was to unscrew the lid of that jar. And I think a lot of it then boils down to how you set people up to succeed, but also how you steer them toward, again, that deeper sense of purpose in the work that they're doing. And if you can help do that for that employee that you're speaking about, that person's going to find a deeper sense of confidence in direct proportion to the sense in which they find a deeper sense of voice. And the only other thing that I'll add to that story is to remember the larger context of this. I've told this story as if it were just this isolated little dyad, Diane Jocelyn, floating in their little bubble at Procter & Gamble. Well, it's worth asking the question, how does Diane Dietz, who is on many levels very un-P&G, P&G is, as many of you may know, very buttoned down, kind of conservative, culturally, politically kind of environment. And Diane, as I said, is just all over the place, brash, emotive, kind of bull in a china shop. And you could look at somebody like Diane and think, that personality type is going to get squeezed out of this company, does not fit. And you ask yourself, how is it that she's managed not only to survive but to thrive in the company? And the answer is that When Diane was about Jocelyn's age and stage, she met a guy named John Pepper. John Pepper was the CEO at the time. And John saw something in Diane, saw that spark, but also saw that the company was starting to smush Diane down, starting to try to rub her rough edges off. And what John said to Diane was, you don't change a thing about who you are. Don't let anybody give you pushback. And if somebody does give you pushback, you come tell me. Because if this company is going to survive another 100 whatever years, we're going to need people like you leading us in the next generation. And so he gave her the confidence to believe that her voice and her instincts and her way of being were okay. And we're not just okay, we're necessary for the company to survive. Well, where did John Pepper get that? You know, John Pepper is, in fact, classic P&G. You know, he's Yale, class of '53, United States Navy, crew cut, button down, and the whole thing. You know, where did John Pepper get that belief and attitude that allows him to see a Diane Dietz for what she is? And the answer is that when John Pepper was Diane's age, he met a guy named Jack Claggett, who was a CEO before him. And one thing that Jack Claggett said to John was, you know, you have the stuff one day to run this company. You really do. But you need to fail some more. And so what Jack Claggett did was he put John, who was, you know, working in Cincinnati there, he put John in charge of laundry care in Asia. And John knew neither laundry care nor Asia. So he put him in a situation where he was going to have to stumble and fall and falter and kind of play catch up with himself every day. But he told John why he was doing it. And he told John that there was a method to that seeming madness. And anyway, the point is that there's a chain. There's a context. And if you think about the groups that you work in, the teams that you're in, you don't exist in these little dyad bubbles. You are parts of chains. Now, those chains may be rusty. Those chains may be neglected. Those chains may not be even visible to you, but you are part of one. And I think that that is you know, something where at P&G, as I think increasingly at places like Microsoft, you know, much younger companies that are reaching both in scale and age maturity, a really important thing to think about. P&G is obsessive about developing talent from within. They have to be. I mean, they have this stated philosophy that they live by that some 90% of their workforce outside of entry-level employees comes from within. They're not in the habit of just borrowing talent from outside. And Microsoft's not there yet, and it can't be for many reasons. I mean, it's a very different ball of wax to be managing supertanker brands like Tide than it is to be innovating in the ways that you have to here. But nonetheless, it is worth thinking about, no matter where you are in the org chart and whether you think of yourself primarily as mentor or primarily as mentee, thinking about what you in your team, you in your unit, you in this division, you in this part of the company can help do to make sure that everybody's mindset is much more about how do we cultivate people's potential. I know it's your PR line now, it's your advertising slogan, you know, your potential, our passion, right? Live it, you know? I mean, live it, literally, every day in the work that you're doing here. I don't know Microsoft well enough to know whether that prompts excitement or mere cynicism, probably some combination of the two. But I think that's really important. Yes?
I was wondering through your Freddie story whether it wouldn't have been helpful for you to interview him to find out why that didn't work. If he was even self-aware enough to be able to think of how it could play differently.
I did have some conversations with Freddie, and you know, I encountered the same challenges that Brian did in communicating with him. He's not incredibly reflective about himself, and he's not incredibly communicative about what he does think about. He's got a great deal of, for reasons that I'm not even sure what they have, where they originate, whether it's family experience or early career experience, or simply cultural influence. I mean, he has an overriding need to project strength and not to admit weakness. And so in that story, it's absolutely the case that Freddie himself, you know, Freddie's no Brian Price. As a teacher, I mean, as a student, Freddie is not as self-aware or engaged as Brian is as a teacher. Because if he were, Freddie would be asking himself, what could I have done differently? Who else could I have turned to? Okay, I didn't really connect with Brian Price, but maybe I could have talked to Jamie Moyer, who's a veteran pitcher on the team. Or maybe I could have talked to one of the coaches, one of the other coaches who's not a pitching coach, but is Latino like me, and maybe we could talk in a more comfortable way. But that wasn't Freddie's mindset, and I think it does lead me to one observation about everybody who I've written about in Guiding Lights, and that is that every one of them, although they are primarily there because they are great teachers and mentors and leaders and managers and what have you, that the one thing they all have in common, no matter where they're coming from, is that they are all voracious, insatiable learners. Every one of them sees himself or herself as imperfect, unfinished, still in formation. We had this event end of January at McCall Hall, the Opera House at Seattle Center, where we actually flew in 9 of the people from the book. Brian and the Hollywood acting coach and the Marine drill instructor and the clown and all these folks for kind of a roundtable conversation about what they do and how they do it. And I was a little worried because I had to moderate this, that it would take a while to get the conversation going. But it took about 2 minutes because immediately they all wanted to pump each other for information. And Brian wanted to talk to Ivana, the acting coach, about performance anxiety. And Ivana wanted to talk to Peter Hall, the Marine drill instructor, about improvising under stressful circumstances. And so on and so forth. They all found these chords of connection. And that all speaks to the fact that every one of them is this voracious learner. And the way that I organize the stories in this book, it's a very story-driven book, but I have organized them into 5 sections. And each section revolves around a single principle of mindful mentoring. And I won't march through those, but the last one of those 5 speaks to this, and it's simply called switching shoes. And it's about the idea that oftentimes the best way to teach somebody something is to put them in a position where they have to teach it to somebody else. To make them see that we are all, every one of us, simultaneously learner and teacher. And we get better at being one by focusing on our work on the other. And I think that is so deeply pertinent in a corporate environment, and just as powerfully true there as it is in a Montessori preschool or Marine Corps boot camp.
One of the things we talk a lot about Microsoft is creating a culture of innovation. And then very often what comes right after that is well, we need to have a culture that's really resilient to risk, where risk is an okay thing to have and failure is an okay thing. But we also then have to talk about the bottom line. And so I was wondering, in your experiences in corporate America, what does a culture that is sort of resilient to risk look like? What does that what are the nuts and bolts of that?
That's a fantastic question. I think culture talk is something that it's very easy to get quickly cynical about when you're working in a business. And it's very easy to kind of enumerate things that you think on paper ought to be features of a culture of innovation, say. To my mind, it's less about the, Microsoft, I'm sure Microsoft Research has something like this. P&G passes out little, pocket cards that have kind of 5 guiding principles for the P&G way. Starbucks has something similar. Boeing, I think, has something similar. These kind of carved in stone tablets and, articulations of these are our values and this is our culture. Now, it's nice. I mean, it's better to have that than not to have that, right? It says something about how much you have your act together as a company. But I put very little stock in that kind of stuff because if you go to Starbucks, which I've spent a fair amount of time with, one of the people who I wrote about in the first draft of the book, he didn't make it into the book, is a guy who's a mid-level, actually, junior to mid-level manager at Starbucks, who at the time I met him had only been at the company maybe 3-4 years, whose prior experience was as a Navy SEAL. And so we talked a lot about cultures, and about what was mappable and transferable from the Navy, from the SEAL culture of excellence, teamwork, resiliency, risk-taking, improvisation around failure. What was mappable from that to Starbucks, and the things that he focused on in his answers to me were not the formal language of one culture versus the other, and how each culture talked about itself. He fixated on tiny little things, on small ways that people behaved toward each other that were not part of the official part of anything, about the ways in which conversations, post-mortem type conversations about failed missions in either environment were either encouraged or shut down, by a leader. And what he talked about ultimately that to me was very interesting was, to him, the crux of it was how each place dealt with fear. Because when you boil down risk and you boil down innovation, a lot of what inhibits risk-taking and innovation is fear. Fear of simply failing, or fear of leading people down a blind alley, or fear of, any number of different kinds of fears. And the thing that he learned in his SEAL experience was how to master that kind of fear. Not smush it down, not run away from it, not deny it, not tough it out, but face it squarely and look it straight in the eye. The fear that when you're on this insertion mission, he was in Afghanistan and all these other places, the fear of 100 different things that could go wrong, and you're in missions where your death wouldn't even be formally acknowledged because it's not supposed to be happening. All these fears that they have to just face and say, this is part of what we live with. And how do we take the tension that this fear creates and turn it into something positive, both during the mission and after the mission, when we're kind of examining how the mission went. And he talked about how he tried to see how Starbucks was doing at that as well. And his review was favorable in that regard. That's one thing that Starbucks is good at, is encouraging its employees to think about and to talk about what they're scared of. It's just part of the, I'm not saying they're having therapy groups in their staff meetings, but I am saying that they're able to talk about what they're worried about on the most tiny details of execution to the largest parameters of grand strategy, for expansion or what have you. What they're worried about, what they're scared of in their own capacities, what they're scared of down the road if they even get success. And he thought that was really a core part of what was attractive to him about Starbucks. Now, I tell that whole story because I think when you think about here, what undergirds a really thriving culture of innovation, has to do less with the formal dimensions of, we'll give you X amount of time where you don't have to show, a business, a profit on your project, or we will, there are a lot of formal things that a company can do through fellowships or research projects or things like that to kind of send a message that research for its own purpose and in its own right matters and is valuable, and go forth and take risks. But what matters just as much is much more on the daily basis how the equivalent of the platoon leaders, not the battlefield generals, the squad leaders, the platoon leaders, the company commanders, people who lead 12, 28, 180 people, that's where so much of the culture gets made, in what tone they set about risk-taking, what tone they set about whether they take the old Juilliard slap-your-wrist approach to mistakes or the Bob Abramson approach, which is turn a mistake into a moment of inquiry. That tone gets set at that level there in an organization. And so I think my second part of my answer to your question is a real focus on where the equivalent of junior officers, how junior officers lead, and how junior officers are trained to lead. Because that's where so much of so many people's experience of the culture gets made. Now, I alluded earlier to a tour mentor story I wanted to tell you, and I can kind of speak to that in connection with your question. I worked at Real Networks for a couple of years. It's, as you know, a direct descendant of the Microsoft mothership and culture, even though in many ways it's in a competitive posture in the marketplace. The CEO of Real spent many years here at Microsoft, so did many of the early leaders of Real, and inherited, I think, both the best and the worst of early Microsoft. This incredible hard-charging approach, this incredibly aggressively entrepreneurial mindset, this love and embrace of risk, this fascination with true innovation, this disregard for tradition or org charts or boxes or the way things are supposed to be, right? All of that. But the downsides of what Real inherited from Microsoft was a sense that, I'll never forget this, actually, on my very first day or maybe week on the job, and I was an executive there, one of my colleagues came over to me and said, well, welcome to Real. At Real, there's no learning curve here. There's just a learning cliff. We push people off that cliff and see if you can fly, And he said it kind of in this kind of sort of locker roomy, kind of joking sort of way, like, welcome to the team. It was not meant to either scare or intimidate. It was just kind of a machismo thing, But to me, that was the very worst of what you could have in not just old Microsoft, but a lot of the tech companies of the boom years, This sense that we are a gathering of really smart people, and we're going to follow completely Darwinian rules about who does well, how things go, what succeeds, what rises to the top, and we'll see what happens. That's a necessary byproduct of working externally in a Darwinian marketplace to some degree. And when you have boom times and a lot of other enticements to allow people to ignore a lot of downsides of the work environment, you can overlook certain shortcomings. But the reality is that even if the boom had extended for many years, that just as Microsoft did when it reached 7, 8, 9, 10 years old and went through great growing pains, Real Networks, Amazon, you name it, all these other tech companies have gone through the same experience. And at the crux, I think, of those growing pains is the question of not just how do we stop the churn of our employees, how do we stop the burnout and the kind of incredible attrition rate, but more deeply, how do we build a culture here where people sense that they can grow in this company? How do we grow our own? How do we start thinking about work as a place where you have talent at different levels and you try to raise everybody's level? That's a different question from innovation, but the cultural dynamics are exactly the same. The question of how do you create a culture of talent development is totally relevant to the question of how do you create a culture of innovation. Because I'll tell you, my experience there, and I'm not picking on Real. Real is a wonderful company with smart, great people, and I admire still everybody who's there. But I think that there were a lot of formal efforts to have formal HR kind of directives about the culture of the company and about what it was going to value, and words. It was words. And ultimately, time and again, those words ran aground on the hard shoals of people's actions. Leaders at every level. And at those junior officer levels, people were not encouraged to be Diane Dietzes, to spend the time cultivating their team. They were encouraged to just squeeze dry everybody on their team for the most they could get before the freaking launch deadline. And that gets you through the launch, but it takes a long time to replenish those dried out husks of people on a team for the next launch. And that is literally and figuratively no way to run a business. So I think when you think about applying that situation to the question of innovation, it's the same thing. It's not about words. It's about deeds and about how empowered or not empowered leaders at the squad and platoon junior levels feel to lead their small units in risk-taking ways. Yes, sir.
How do you balance the management load of a team of, say, 10 people, and you've got 1 or 2 underperformers? Mm-hmm. How do you balance your investment in those underperformers and trying to mentor them to the point where they're performing at a reasonable level versus taking care of your real high performers and feeding and sustaining them because their potential is that much more? You know, it's that old 80-20 rule, right?
I think that's a great question, and I think part of the answer is in taking those high performers and deputizing them to mentor and cultivate your stragglers. But part of the answer as well, which goes back to the switching shoes idea, is to put those low performers into situations where they have to teach and mentor somebody else. Maybe a newcomer to the team, or maybe, you know, somebody else outside the team. But put them in situations as well where they have to take some responsibility, because as anybody knows, there's nothing like having to teach a thing to force you to develop mastery of it. So I think those two things, in terms of the proportion of investment, I mean, you're right. The 80-20 rule, it's hard. I mean, I'm not sure that, you know, there's nothing about, say, Diane Dietz at Procter & Gamble that says that if she'd had one lagging employee, that she would put all her investment in that employee till that person got up to a reasonable level and neglect the rest of the team. You do have to make trade-offs and choices. And it may well be that at the end of the day, if you have a team of 10, and you have 2 low performers, that you have only enough time to get one of them to a high level, and the other one you're going to have to say in candid ways, I want to get you to this place, but you're going to have to take more ownership of it. I think I'm remembering back, actually, not to my time in business, but to my time at the White House. When I was in my second stint at the White House, I helped run the Domestic Policy Council, which was a staff team of about 30-some, and broken up into sub-teams on each different issue area. You know, a healthcare team, a child care team, an education team, a crime team. And some of those teams had really strong leaders, and some of them didn't. And it was a really hard pressure that I faced every day. And quite frankly, when I look back on it, I did not live up to the words that I'm speaking today. I didn't invest a lot of time in bringing up the low performers because I was under a tremendous amount of pressure to get stuff out the door. And I think that that's the challenge, is you don't make those, if you're that manager in that situation, you don't make your decisions in a vacuum. You know, it depends on what range of freedom your boss gives you to really spend coaching and cultivating your low performers. And that boss depends on her or his boss and that person's perspective, you know. And so I think that the other thing that I would do is actually not so much about managing your low performers or worrying about the members of your team, but it's a managing up sort of thing. And really developing an open understanding, a transparent understanding with the people who manage you about how you want to be investing your time. And making a case to them that, look, I've got these 2 folks on this team, and I could neglect them and we could write them off, but I really think that if I put, for this defined period of time, this much effort in bringing these people along, it's going to pay dividends for us. But you got to back me up on this, because it's going to mean that for a period of time, I'm not going to be doing A, B, and C. You know, I think having that learning how to have that conversation upward is at least as important as how you put your problem employees into situations for greater success.
Eric, I'm actually going to have to cut off questions because we're getting close to 3 o'clock, and I want people to have time
Oh,
to
yes.
check out your book. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.